Hello and welcome to Seed Speaks. My name is Sonia Begeman. I'm the editorial director here at Seed World Group. I am so excited because today we are going to be dishing up the latest on Farm to Fork, a proposed strategy in Europe. Joining me today is Cesar Gonzalez. He is the manager of public affairs at Euroseeds. And also joining me is Jason Beckman. He's USDA's Economic Research Service acting branch chief of the International Trade and Development Branch in the Market and Trade Economics Division. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. This is a really important topic to talk about, and it's important not just for Europe, but it is important globally. So I think first I'm going to highlight just a couple details about the Farm to Fork strategy that will be helpful for our audience to kind of keep in the back of their mind. So the first thing to highlight is it is a 10-year strategy targeting a more climate neutral, reducing the impact of climate change by 2030. One of the proposals is they want to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%. It calls to increase organic production to 25%. It wants to reduce nutrient loss by 50%, which would require farmers to use 20% less fertilizer. And while, we are a seed-focused industry in terms of Seed World Group, there are some animal and livestock implications. So I'll quickly hit those. They want to see more carbon-efficient livestock, and that would include a 50% reduction in antimicrobials used in farmed livestock and aquaculture. That's just a few of the changes. And so, Cesar, I'm actually going to turn to you. Those are some of the really high-level changes we're seeing proposed in agriculture. Is there anything that I missed? You're involved in this, almost every day. So are there any other big changes to talk about? And, what are the particular changes that have really interest or piqued the interest of, the seed industry and Euroseeds?
No, I mean, you say it very well. These are the main targets that are considered within the Farm to Fork strategy. However, what I would say is that the Farm to Fork strategy actually it's a more comprehensive document that touches upon many more topics. At least two of them probably related directly to seeds. One is about seed diversity and how to increase diversity in seeds or whatever you call it, crop varieties in Europe. And the other one, clearly, it's targeting the new technologies for plant breeding, what we call here novel genomic techniques. But part of those who are very targeted to seeds, there are other targeting a framework for sustainable agri-food systems, and probably devoting 10% of land to non-agricultural features or types of land. This has been somehow shaped, but it's a more comprehensive document. But of course, once you establish a clear target, like the ones you were mentioning, the 50% reduction pesticides, the 20% reduction fertilizers, or the 25% of organic land, of course, these are the ones who really catch the attention of the people, and that are the lookup. So I think you make a very good summary.
There's a lot to talk about, and I think we could probably dive through that large document for the entire time. But I think you're right, kind of address some of the big hit issues. So, Jason, actually, I wanted to ask you. So, obviously, this is a Europe proposal, but it is going to have implications globally and in the U.S. And so, it was almost a year ago in November that the ERS released a study regarding Farm to Fork and that global impact on production and food security. So, kind of in regards to that study, can you maybe tell me a little bit about what that study was? And then we'll dive in a little bit deeper with some of the findings that you had. So how did you conduct this study and what was the purpose of it?
Sure. So USDA is always interested in any sort of policy that could have global implications on agriculture, and in this case, also have implications on global food security. So we saw this policy came about in May. There was no economic assessment provided by the European Commission at the time. So we thought it would be a nice piece of research to investigate the potential economic impacts of some of the strategies that Caesar talked about. So as he mentioned, it's much more than fertilizer and pesticide reductions, and there's some potential climate implications. But basically, we just did a quick dive to see what are those that could impact global agricultural production. So they are what we considered is basically what you mentioned, the reduction in pesticides, fertilizers, antimicrobials, and the removal of the 10% of land in agriculture. So yeah, basically the whole purpose of it was just to see what's going to happen to global markets and what's going to happen to global food security.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely dive into that as we continue our conversation here. So Caesar, I do want to talk about one of those key points in the farm to fork strategy, and that is this increase to 25% organic production. I mean, that's a big change. Organic, it's a lot different than conventional. It's a lot different in terms of, what you can plant, what you can apply, fertilizers to pesticides, you name it. Everything about your production changes. And so I'm curious, you work with seed companies and you work with the agriculture industry at large. What has been the response to this proposal of 25%? Are seed companies seeing this as this is my opportunity to differentiate myself and find, a better organic product to provide my customers? Or are they expressing some concern? What has been the consensus in Europe about, 25% of the land being organic?
Well, increasing the organic land, agricultural organic land, I mean, it's a trend already. And we are now somewhere around 8.5% in Europe, including permanent crops and permanent pastures. So less arable land and more permanent crops. But it's already a trend. And we have nothing against it in case it's a demand-driven increase. So indeed, if there is a real demand, the companies are willing to engage in the discussion and provide more seeds for that growing market. And I would say this is already the case, for instance, for vegetables. But what we see is a mismatch between the market demand, which in the organic sector is mostly for vegetables, others as well, but the big market is for vegetables, while the political discussion turns around organic land, which it's not the same because for to reach 25% organic land, you can't do that only with vegetables, and this is not. We don't have the acreage here in Europe to do that, and then the question remains: what are these other productions that will look into the organic, and probably, and this is something that may have implications for the common agricultural policy. How to incentivize farmers to change and to move to organic and remain economically viable, because in this case, turning from conventional to organic requires adaptation, and it's not an easy task and requires some funding to compensate the losses that the farmer incurs when changing from one system to another. So probably there is another type of trend or another time of push that will come from a policy angle, probably not from a market perspective, and we would say, less happy with that.
Yeah, well, speaking of policies and to kind of follow up on this, we're looking at the potential for it's a threat. It's a threat to these European farmers who are farming conventionally and maybe they don't grow vegetable crops. So it's something that's a big change. It's something that could make them less productive potentially because, they have new threats that they can't fight with some of the traditional pesticides. We've heard discussion that this farm to fork strategy could open doors for new policy regarding some of the gene editing, novel gene, I can't remember what you called it, but some of this, more precision technology. Can you talk a little bit about, any discussions policy-wise that would make farm to fork maybe a bridge to allow EU farmers access to more precise gene edited products?
Yes. Yeah, it's true that the Farm to Fork addresses the topic of novel genomic techniques, as we call it here now, and but yeah, it considers these novel genomic techniques as a way to overcome some of the, let's say, sustainability challenges that we will face, because indeed these technologies would serve to provide the market, supply the market with new varieties that would perform better in terms of sustainability. And this is acknowledged both in the Farm to Fork and in the report that the Commission published some time ago on the matter. But and we support it a lot, of course. But what we might miss is the political push from the Parliament, which has to endorse any kind of a new legal text that would allow this to come to market, no, to make these technologies to come to the market. So we see two speeds: one for banning technologies, and the other one for allowing technologies in Europe. And of course, we would like to push much more, and we would like the Commission and the Parliament mostly to embrace it clearly and to say, yes, indeed, this can help. Maybe it's not a silver bullet. This won't solve all the problems, but this is one of the technologies that for sure can help to achieve the objective without major, let's say, hurdles to farmers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, speaking of, this idea of productivity, Jason, your guys' study from November 2020 talked a lot about production and talked about potential hits to production from this switch to not only organic, but taking 10% of land out of production and, taking out some of these pesticides that do help protect yield. So can you talk to me a little bit about what the overall impact is that you guys found if EU only adopted the strategy versus, what would the productivity hit be if it was a more global or just a larger scale adoption of this farm to fork strategy?
Sure. So, I mean, we found that, using basic economics, if you're restricting inputs into production, farmers are going to have to react in a way that likely decreases production. So, you have less fertilizer, you have less pesticides to use. And so this is what our results found. So we, estimate the impacts for the EU and for other countries around the world. We found some double-digit decreases for EU production for many crops, and increases for other countries that are much smaller. But basically, what happens is if they have a decrease in production, the EU basically has to import more agricultural products. And so other countries react a little bit. They increase their production and send more to the EU. And we found, it's not in this study, but it's in a journal article that we published a couple of months ago. We found that to mitigate the production changes and price changes from the EU adopting the strategies, it would require a big increase in productivity, which is on the order of what they've experienced the last 30 years. For the global scenario, we basically find results happening across the board. All countries in the world, if they're reducing fertilizer uses by 20% and pesticides by 50%, they're getting double-digit decreases in production for all crops. And then these crops, the decrease in the production in crops eventually finds its way downstream to other products such as feed, ethanol, processed foods, and that sort of things.
Now, I'm curious, Jason, in your study, what was the bigger impact? The idea of taking 10% of land out of production, or some of those, taking out fertilizer and pesticides? Which ones seem to, in your estimates, have the bigger impact on productivity?
So we actually didn't break it out to see which were the restrictions that were causing the changes. What I could say is that we did look at the input cost for each of the crops. So, how much farmers are paying for land, pesticides, and fertilizers relative to other crops. And so, obviously, if you're more dependent on pesticides like in fruits and vegetables or fertilizers such as with corn, then those were the crops that were taking the bigger hit.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, Caesar, we're talking a lot about farm to fork. We're talking about this strategy, but it's not set in stone yet, is it? What are those next steps to, take it from this proposal to potentially being something that is set in stone as a policy? What's the next step for this?
Well, you're totally right. On the one hand, the Commission always claim that these are aspirational targets, meaning even in the case that they would be fully endorsed by anyone, still they are not carved in stone. So they don't become legal even after the endorsement of everyone. But still, the Parliament, the European Parliament, is still discussing how to position itself about the farm to fork. This will be done in 2 weeks' time. So the final text or the final draft has been will be voted in 2 weeks' time. What can I say? The Parliament in some cases wants to go farther than the Commission. So in some of the aspects, in some others they want to give some flexibility. But overall, the result that the members of the Parliament will vote in that will give a clear signal to the Commission about what is the appetite from politicians, from decision makers about this on the one hand. And then the other hand, of course, here in Europe, we have member states that have to implement those measures at the end and have to ratify. And then the big fight is, of course, for the common agricultural policy and whether or not to integrate some of these or all of these indicators, etc., into the legal text of the common agricultural policy, and therefore in the requirements that EU farmers have to comply with in order to receive the subsidies and in order to actually qualify for all the market, etc. So that has been a problem so far because there is no clear understanding on how member states, which are now in the process of defining their national strategic plans for the common agricultural policy, how will they implement those targets and those measures within their national strategic plans. And there, of course, they are not legal. So in principle, it's up to them, but the pressure on member states will be very high not to react to those. So indeed, it's not finished.
Mm-hmm. Well, that actually brings up a really great question that we just had from our audience, from Ashley. And, you mentioned each of the member states are going to have to, figure out implementation, and there's much yet to be determined. Well, Ashley had a great question. And, of the member states, are there any that you think will be more directly impacted by this proposal, this farm to fork strategy, than others? And who would that be?
It would depend. I guess it would depend a lot on the type of measure you would consider. I would say that, of course, the big producers in Europe will be the most affected ones. I'm clearly thinking about probably Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Romania, probably Poland, and those who, although they are farming is very important in other countries as well, but those who rely less on that, and that, for instance, I'm thinking organic land in Austria is already about 25%. So for them, this wouldn't make any difference, probably. So they might have being impacted by the other indicators, but not for this one. So indeed, it's not an even, let's say, impact in all EU countries, but I would say the big producers, of course, because then they go probably through more commodity markets, and then the impact probably will be much bigger.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jason, to kind of jump off of that question, I know the research that you guys performed, you looked at not only the impact on Europe, but globally, and you looked at food security, and you looked at things like hunger and food scarcity. Can you talk to me about, what farm to fork strategy could mean for food security, especially in some of those more at-risk types of countries?
Sure. So the work that we did to estimate the impacts to global food security uses this international food security assessment model that we have at ERS that considers food security in the 76 poorest countries in the world. And it's a demand-driven model such that the impact is seen by higher food prices. We were seeing in the model that Africa had 100 million more food insecure people because of higher food prices. One interesting aspect is the potential impacts to agricultural production, and what would happen if the EU wanted to place these input restrictions on imported products, and would the African producers suffer? But that is something that we didn't investigate in our study.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you brought up the idea of trade. And I think that's one thing that is still unclear to everyone. And so, Cesar, I'm curious to hear what you've heard. If you guys adopt farm to fork and you have this requirement for, 50% less pesticide and, 20% less fertilizer and things like that, when it comes to international trade and importing, so when you import soybeans from the United States, for example, will your partners, your trade partners, be held to the same standards as the farm to fork? Or, what will that trade situation look like? Will it be, more restrictive to make sure everyone's complying to the policy, or what do you think?
Well, I think that there is, politically, I think there is no choice, because the Commission claims that this won't have a bigger impact on EU farmers than for others. So indeed, we tend to disagree, and we think that any adjustment that will be done in the agri-food chain in Europe at the end will impact farmers' incomes, and therefore there will be an impact on them. So the only way politically to sell it is to say, okay, then for third countries, for those who export to the EU, then we will raise the bar, and then we will try to have probably not equivalent standards, but to have the same standards. And then indeed, I would say, as the sector in Europe, we may have a problem because, well, on the one hand, you were mentioning soya. There are some issues with protein self-sufficiency here in Europe. But if we start to impose non-agreed standards to third countries, probably there will be retaliation. So this is not, from our point of view, this is not the way to go. For sure, it's not something that we would be happy to see, but it's already hinted in the farm to fork with this carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the Commission already sees some kind of potential firebacks and tries to already counterbalance them. But yeah, this is one of our main worries, that indeed this will have an impact on trade at international level. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, trade is so critical for all countries, and so that makes a lot of sense. Now, Jason, in your research that you've done, Cesar kind of hinted there about what the impact will be for EU farmers and things like that, and this idea that it could change the way we trade, with these member countries. What have you guys found, is likely going to be the impact to the U.S. farmer if this strategy is adopted?
Well, if it's such that the EU doesn't impose the standards on other countries, then it's a potential boon to U.S. exports. Of course, there are the TRQs that limit, for example, beef imports or pork imports. But the US is quite competitive in producing all these products. And if the EU doesn't impose the same standards, then you can imagine that this would be a destination for exports. If the EU does impose the standards, then it's a matter of farmers either choosing to adopt the strategies. So we have that instance for non-hormone treated beef, where it's profitable for a small group of farmers to produce beef, mainly for the EU export market. But is it going to be the case for all these other products when there's a lot of other global markets available? That's a question.
It's not easy. This is all very complex. Is kind of the big takeaway for sure. And so I have time for one last question. And Caesar, I want to ask you. Euroseeds is obviously a leader in the seed industry for Europe, and you guys are very involved, and you yourself are very involved in figuring out this farm to fork strategy and what it means. When you guys look at what they've proposed, I mean, what are those changes that you want to see, or are there changes that you want to see to this policy?
Yeah, we made our own impact assessment. We commissioned a study to see what will be the impact, and indeed we found similar things like in the USDA report, ERS report. Sorry. So what we would like to see at the end clearly is that they embrace technology as one of the ways to move forward. I mean, you can't really think that you will achieve more with less unless you embrace technology. There is no other way. Coming back to other types of agriculture probably won't be as effective as the new ones are. So if you think about new varieties, they are less, let's say, less dependent on inputs. You have more pest and disease resistance and tolerances. You have higher efficiency in the use of nitrogen. You have higher yields. So at the end, these new technologies, plant breeding particularly, allow to compensate some of the challenges, and therefore what we would like to see is that indeed there is a broad agreement that only with new technologies we can move forward. Otherwise, from our point of view, we won't be able to, on the one hand, reach the targets and not having the negative consequences that we have already been expressed here, and that apparently there is a bunch of reports that show.
Yeah, it's technology is obviously a solution. I think you hit the nail on the head there as we talk about it. It makes sense. That's what you're encouraging. So, well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. So thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much, Caesar, for your time and expertise today. I really appreciate it. This is an evolving subject, and obviously in 2 weeks we're going to have more to talk about, so expect a phone call, Caesar, and we'll continue this conversation.
Happy to do that.
And for everyone else, if you'd like to rewatch this, we will have it available on our Facebook and YouTube pages. In addition to that, I will provide a written article on our websites that you'll be able to see in the coming days. But don't forget, next week we also have another great episode of Seed Speaks. Mark Zinkowitz will be hosting and he's asking the question, why do GMOs have an image problem? So we know that GMOs can help increase yields by protecting the plant, but why do they have this image problem? He has 3 great guests joining him. He has Andreas Bacher of the University of Guelph, a freelance journalist named Kevin Sinpathy, and a Specialty Foods Vice President, Jen Arman. And they're going to talk about, why consumers have the views they do about GMOs and that technology, and then what the industry can do to change that. If it needs to change, we'll find out next week if everyone agrees with that. So be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 12 o'clock to hear that great conversation. Thanks so much.